Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to come along talk to you today. Thanks for arranging it, Sam. So I'm going to talk about the latest kind of interpretation of Nazi Germany, the latest kind of like orthodoxy in the historiography. And this is the idea that Nazism, the regime, was a consensual dictatorship. So I'll come on to that kind of shortly. I just want to set up kind of what this interpretation is playing off. I think this might help to kind of to teach it to A-level students as well, having a sense of how the two kind of interrelate. So this was the original interpretation of Nazi Germany by historians. And it's the idea of it as being a totalitarian kind of like big brother type polity. And this really emerges from the Nuremberg trials, which were in 1945 to 1946, where the leading Nazis are prosecuted for a conspiracy to launch a war of conquest. Now, because Nuremberg was a trial of these individual Nazis, the whole case was put together in such a way as to pin all of the blame onto them as decision makers at the top. So this meant that all the documents that are chosen by the prosecutors at Nuremberg all work in the same direction to ascribe complete culpability to the surviving Nazis. So here you have Göring on the far left of the picture, and then that's Rudolf Hess, and that's Ribbentrop. And I'm not sure who's at the front, it might be Keitel. But these are kind of like the people that are basically kind of like carrying the can for the entirety of the Nazi regime. And the prosecutors succeed in this approach. All of the defendants, most of them are sentenced to death. Now, the side effect of this particular way of presenting Nazi Germany for the purposes of the Nuremberg trials is a kind of a picture emerges of how the Nazi state operates, which is attached to this this blaming of the individuals at the top. And this is the idea of a kind of a big brother state, which was based on a strict hierarchy, blind obedience, and the threats of the Gestapo and the concentration camps for those who didn't go along. And as you probably know, George Orwell was writing 1984, kind of while the Nuremberg trials were happening. Now, this interpretation was also congruent with the kind of historical record that's left behind by the police and the Gestapo and the SS. And so the people that produced these kind of files wanted to show to people above what terrific policemen they were. So their basic line was to say that we know everything. We have a kind of a sinister omniscience, and we know what's happening in every single ordinary German's lives. So this was obviously congruent with the idea of a state that's run very much from above on a form of surveillance. And these files and the Nuremberg documents, which are chosen to prove this particular case against Göring and co, then become the raw materials for the first version of the history of Nazi Germany. So the most famous one is a book by William L. Shirer from 1960, which was called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And German historians aren't allowed even to use or access this material until 1956. So this initial interpretation is pretty much uncontested because US and British historians are making the running. Now, this interpretation of Nazi Germany lets the non-leading Nazis very much off the hook. So it's very useful for the West during the early Cold War because it kind of morally rehabilitates normal Germans who weren't leading Nazis or weren't Hitler, Himmler or Heydrich, who are all dead by now, as kind of like as being essentially blameless, as having no control over what had happened during the dictatorship. If the Nazi elite were to blame for everything, then ordinary West Germans could be welcomed back into the warm grasp of civilization. So this is really the initial kind of interpretation that lasts, and it's chipped away at probably until the 1980s. Now we have a very, very different way of contemplating the Nazi dictatorship. It's a completely inverted picture, and it's inverted so much that it should make us suspicious that something is happening here that's not purely attributable to the sources that have been found by the historians. So these are, you may have come across some of these on your reading list. So Robert Galately's Backing Hitler, I'm going to talk about quite a lot. Peter Fritscher, Germans into Nazis came out in 1998. Götz, who's a German historian, Hitler's Beneficiaries. He writes about the Third Reich's economy and how it supposedly redistributed wealth from Jews to ordinary Germans. Daniel Goldhagen's Hitler's Winning Executioners, famous book from 1996, in which he argued essentially that ordinary Germans were only too happy to play their part in the Holocaust because they were animated by an obsessive anti-Semitism, all of them. This is the argument. What We Knew is an oral history by Johnson and Royband, which I'm going to talk about in this talk as well. And then Richard Evans, The Third Reich in Power. Now, this is maybe a bit unfair to include Evans in this bracket, but you can see from the cover that it's very much congruent with a way of kind of stressing the giddy joy of life in Nazi Germany. And the subtitle too, The Nazis Won Over the Hearts and Minds of a Nation. And altogether, these amount to a complete inversion of the totalitarian reading of Nazi Germany. It's become very fashionable amongst historians, but especially amongst American historians. And the basic premise is that rather than being a dangerous and all-seeing dictatorship, the Nazis had no need to terrorize anybody in the first place, because the vast majority of Germans actively welcomed the regime and actively welcomed the policies of the regime. So there's various terms have been applied to this new kind of like orthodoxy in the scholarship. And the Southampton historian, Professor Neil Gregor, calls it the voluntarist turn, which I think is a useful way of thinking about this move from people being intimidated to people doing things because they wanted to from their inner belief system. So these are some examples of the claims that you'll find in this new voluntarist orthodoxy. And this comes from who's really the pioneering historian of the voluntarist turn, Robert Galately, and the book is Backing Hitler. So these are some of the examples of the claims and the way that they're made. And I've helpfully highlighted the bits in red, which tell us that something is going on here beyond kind of pure consultation of the sources. So Weimar had been loved by almost no one in Germany. Beginning in 1933, the police and Nazi stormtroopers started cracking heads, but not much more than a mini wave of terror swept Germany. From 1933, consensus in favor of Hitler and increasingly also Nazism was virtually never in doubt. And the great majority of German people soon became devoted to Hitler, and they supported him to the bitter end in 1945. There's some pretty kind of like, you know, Fourth Reich claims here, which utterly invert previous understandings of how the Nazi dictatorship operate. So interesting stuff. But as historians, we need to really drill down and think about the kind of sources that are being used to support these particular claims. So I'll review some of the key sources for the record here. So probably the most convincing type of evidence for all this is research since the 1980s into the Gestapo, so the Nazi secret police. Just after the Second World War, one historian estimated that there'd been an army of around 250,000 Gestapo agents marauding through Germany, prying into ordinary Germans, into every facet of their lives. In fact, it became apparent in the 1980s when Galately and others started to research that the actual headcount of the Gestapo is much, much smaller than this. And so in 1937, for example, for a population of then 65 million, it went up to higher obviously after the Anschluss and the Sudetenland, there's just 7,000 full-time secret policemen covering the whole of Germany. And if we compare this to the other kind of comparable dictatorships, you've got at least 40,000 in the Soviet NKVD, so the Soviet secret police, and you've got 90,000 Stasi agents and informants in East Germany for a much, much, much smaller population. So instead, these historians show the way that Nazi Germany worked was much more about ordinary informants and snitchers, if you will, so a kind of a self-policing. And whatever it is, it's definitely not the kind of totalitarian panoptical surveillance that we take away from George Orwell's kind of like writing, or from the initial interpretation of Nazi Germany at Nuremberg. This is one type of evidence, and it's quite a convincing piece of evidence. Then you have the relatively low population of the concentration camps in Germany between 1934 and 1938. I'll talk a bit more about the camps in due course, but for here we just need to note only that the population of all the camps in Germany is in the thousands, single thousands between 1934 and 1938, when it fills up quickly with the Kristallnacht pogrom. But in these 4 years after the Nazis have secured power and before the Kristallnacht pogrom, you've only got thousands. If you compare this to the Gulag in Stalin's Russia, you've got about 5 million prisoners languishing in the Gulag in 1936 in Russia. So again, this seems like, you know, pretty small fry in terms of terror. Then you've got the fact that whereas Lenin and Mussolini and Franco all kind of seized power in some way, 14 million Germans cast their vote for Hitler and for the NSDAP, more specifically, in November and July 1932, and then in November 1932, and then again in March 1933. And these are, apart from March 1933, pretty free votes under one of the most democratic and progressive constitutions in history. So this again seems to set apart from the idea of a population that's been kind of terrorized into acquiescence. So they voted as a voluntarist act. No one forced them to vote for the Nazis. Then you've also got visual evidence. So all of us have seen scenes on television documentaries we're on every week, it seems, of euphoric crowds, children waving Nazi flags, women swooning with emotion, all swept up by Hitler's singular charisma. And these historians I've talked about note, and quite reasonably, this is not really how people behaved in the Weimar Republic. No one swooned when Friedrich Ebert was making a speech in 1923. Then you've got the referenda. So referenda were a popular tool for demagogues in the interwar period, and some would say they should be left to demagogues in the interwar period. But Nazi referenda delivered 95% yeses on the whole. Now, it used to be thought this must be down to kind of intimidation of people at the ballot box, no null answer on the form, SA men lurking around outside with cameras. But now it's presented as being somehow a measure of the Nazis' popularity. That this 95%, although obviously it's somehow inflated by kind of like massaging of the figures and intimidation, it still nevertheless takes us somewhere towards the way that German people felt about Hitler and the Nazi regime. Now, the explanation for this popularity, and you've got a slightly circular argument here in which the explanation is inferred from the presence of a support that isn't established properly in the first place. I'm going to come back to, I think Arthur's going to talk about this as well. So the explanation given is that the Nazis rescued Germany from the Great Depression, and they enjoyed success on the diplomatic stage pretty much constantly from 1933 through until 1941. And you've also got the fact that the population, according to Galately and co., generally agreed with the Nazis' crackdown on unloved outsiders, so particularly German Jews, but also layabouts, so-called asocials, and unpatriotic elements. And the essential argument is that unless you happen to be a member of an unloved and tiny minority in Nazi Germany, above all German Jews, there was little to fear and everything to feel good about. And this is all very much the kind of like the dominant interpretation amongst historians these days of Nazi Germany, overwhelmingly so in Germany, Israel, and the US. But what I want to suggest to you today is that the evidence for all this actually is quite brittle and is capable to being read in other directions. And to illustrate this, I want to zoom in now on one of the important texts in the voluntarist turn canon that I mentioned earlier. This is an oral history of Nazi Germany carried out by an American project in the late 1990s. It's called What We Knew, and it's basically it's a series of 200 interviews that were carried out by Johnson's a US historian. I think Royband is a German social scientist. In the late 1990s, with Germans who had first-hand experience of what life was like in Nazi Germany. Well, they were interested in finding out about the details of everyday life, the micro-social situations, how people felt about other Germans, how they felt about Jews, and to use it to try and draw some conclusions as to how popular the Nazi regime was, how terrorized were people, how excited were they, and that this would be a solid kind of base of evidence to draw some conclusions from. They approached around 400 people, and 200 agreed to take part. So this is a good, this is a good kind of like response rate. And they believed that on the basis of this 200 interviews, they could present for the first time what they called irrefutable proof of the widespread enthusiasm for Hitler and for the Nazis in Nazi Germany. So here's the big takeaway quote. By simply asking the German people themselves in an organized and social scientific way, we are able to demonstrate that the Third Reich was not a living hell for all those who lived in it. Far from living in a state of constant fear and discontent, most Germans led happy and normal lives in Nazi Germany. And again, I've highlighted the part that I think is worth pursuing rather further. And this is what they found out. This is how they justified their extrapolation from these 200 interviews to the entirety of the German population. We had truly questioned a rather representative sample of Jews and non-Jews who had lived in the Third Reich. Now, this is the point where in a lecture or I'm giving a talk at a school, I asked the students to try and work out how their math skills are and to work out if this really is possible, that Johnson and Royband could have questioned a rather representative sample of Jews and non-Jews who had lived in the Third Reich. And some clever clogs in the first or second row would put up their hands when I asked them how old would interviewees have to have been in the 1990s to have any first-hand memory, meaningful experience of Nazi Germany. So how old would they have to have been to have anything to offer to these interviewers, in the 1990s? And someone will say they've got to be in their 70s, they've got to be in their 80s. Absolutely true. To still be, to have any kind of memory, kind of like of 1933 to 1945, they're going to be quite old by the 1990s. This also means, by inference, that when they were in Nazi Germany, they were very young compared to your average ordinary German, and they would have been between kind of 10 and 30, kind of as a fairly kind of expansive bracket for who these interviewees were. This is obviously, you'll be aware now, a structural issue in that the sample they've spoken to cannot possibly be representative of all Germans because it happens to be a very young cohort of people who have been living in Nazi Germany. And in fairness to Johnson and Royband, they do grapple with this particular question. And this is after a lot of thought. This is what they come up with to explain kind of why this isn't a problem for their extrapolation to the attitudes of the entirety of the population. The only significant caveat is that our sample represents a somewhat younger population than had been the average in Germany between 1933 and 1945. Still, most of the people we surveyed had reached adulthood before the Third Reich ended, and because our sample is so large, it is possible to control for the possible distortions caused by this age factor. This again is where I'll ask the students if they're convinced by this. It's not very convincing unless Johnson and Royband have found some exciting new social scientific methodology for communing with the dead, because it's impossible to speak to people who are older during Nazi Germany because they are no longer with us. This would be a problem with any kind of extrapolation from a young cohort to a broader society. So if young people's attitudes were representative of the entirety of wider societies, we would have no Brexit and no Trump, for example. But in Nazi Germany, it's particularly critical because almost all the people who are interviewed in this age bracket have been kind of like through the Hitler Youth generation in Nazi Germany. So they've been singled out by the Nazi regime for a particularly intensive program of indoctrination and socialization into Nazi values. So this would have included the school and the university curriculum, which I'm going to talk to you about briefly soon. These people spent time in the Hitler Youth or the League of German Girls. And if they were men, they went on to serve in the highly ideological German army, the Wehrmacht. So some relief for you, some photographs here. But this is these would be people from this generation in the Jungvolk, which is the kind of the junior branch of the Hitler Youth. Here they are playing at being soldiers in 1938. And for young girls, you have the Bundesdeutsche Mädel, the League of German Girls, and here they are in 1934, putting up posters and generally imbibing the Nazi ethos of racially select togetherness. Most of the people that Jocelyn and Roy interviewed would also have been through the bespoke Nazi curriculum. So here is the curriculum for 16-year-olds in Nazi Germany. I always find that school audiences are very interested in the particulars of the Nazi curriculum. So here we have kind of like how young people are socialized by well, your equivalents in the Nazi dictatorship. Biology shoots up the pecking order and it's rebranded as racial science. Geography, textbooks become fixated with the Nazi master concepts of space and race and Lebensraum. So no longer is kind of like borders are no longer a matter kind of like of countries and policies, they're about space and race. Physics becomes much more about military science. So Einstein's Jewish theory of relativity is expunged and instead it's preoccupied with issues of radio and flight and ballistics, again to socialize, especially young men, into kind of like into military values. History was already very nationalistic in Germany, in schools, or even more at universities. And in this case, the Nazi leaders are simply added to the long pantheon of German great men. In maths, quite famously, the essentials are essentially maintained, but the nature of case studies kind of like undergoes a big shift. And the most infamous example is kind of like arithmetic calculations are based on kind of eugenic burdens of individuals to state finances. Religious instruction, or whatever it's called now, was severely restricted. This was an alternative form of moral authority to the Nazis' ideology, and therefore is kind of like is reduced to a bare minimum in the curriculum, which does upset Catholics, though you wouldn't know it from Galately and Co.'s conceptions of Nazi society. And then PE is expanded to 5 hours a week and becomes the main thing people look for on their reports. This is all a big kind of like turnover from Germany's tradition of a humanistic and technocratic and highly sophisticated education that generations before 1933 would have enjoyed in the Weimar Republic. So by 1934, you've got a picture of Hitler hanging in every classroom in Germany. School children of all ages are forced to stand reverently in their assemblies to listen to radio speeches by the Führer. German teachers are sent on training camps run by the National Socialist Teachers Association, so the Third Reich's equivalent of the NEU. And the lessons are very closely monitored, often by classroom assistants, and these classroom assistants turn out to be SA men who have been given a job and a stipend out of a reward for their contributions to the movement. Now, it's very hard to prove the impact of all of this on young people, but it seems pretty clear to me that the Nazi Germany's success in mobilizing young people through the curriculum, through the Hitler Youth, goes a long way to explaining the Jacobin-like energy of Nazi Germany compared to other dictatorships. So its relentless radicalization, whereas Mussolini's Italy quickly runs out of steam, Franco's Spain, ditto, and even the Soviet Union after Stalin's death, kind of like there's an ebbing of the ideological urgency. Whereas in Nazi Germany, the story is one of ever-increasing radicalization all the way to the uniquely bitter end in 1945. And this was channeled by youth, and it's particularly expressed in the German Wehrmacht. So even after the Second World War, there are opinion polls which are taken by the US Army when it's occupying parts of Germany. And these pollsters find much stronger identification with Hitler and with Nazism amongst the young than amongst the old. So the old have been disillusioned at the very least by 1945, whereas in October 1945, no fewer than 42% of young people revealed they believed the best way to reconstruct Germany was through a, quote, strong new Führer, end quote. And this was compared to 10% amongst the population in general. So kind of, we're talking, you can see that youth is not a particularly kind of like a robust demographic to extrapolate the entirety of the society's views from. So here's a kind of like a quote from the opinion poll. This is the occupation authorities of the US. A considerable difference appeared in the attitude towards Hitler. The majority of youth offering an opinion being ready to excuse Hitler as a good man with bad advisors. The majority of older people condemned Hitler as an evil individual. Now, my contention is that for those who are still not around, and who were not around the 1990s to speak to two history professors about their experience in Nazi Germany, it wouldn't look very much like the youth narrative that I've just related to you. It's actually very, very hard to know what ordinary older Germans felt about life in the Third Reich, because no one thought to ask them during their lifetimes. It's also partly because it's very, very hard to work out from contemporary sources how popular or unpopular a particular regime may be when any public criticism of that regime was a criminal offense, which could land you in prison or in a concentration camp. And there's plenty of evidence that for many millions of Germans, Nazi dictatorship was an experience of terror, whether direct or indirect, and of peer pressure, economic privation, and warfare. Time for some full disclosure here. I was part of a project at Birkbeck University on Nazi concentration camps in the pre-war period. And these camps, of which Dachau was the most famous, were sites of terror against ordinary Germans. And there were not, as many students often still assume, primarily instruments of anti-Semitic policy. So there were a small number of German Jews in the concentration camps, usually around 5 to 7% of the overall prisoner population, and they were much worse treated than the other run-of-the-mill prisoners, but they were still a very small amount. And most of the people in the concentration camps in the pre-war period were from the German trade union movement. So from the Social Democratic Party, or the trade union movement, or from the Communist Party. So what our project was doing between 2006 and 2009, but in these books which have come out kind of like regularly ever since, was to bring terror and violence back into focus and to demonstrate that it was by no means targeted only against unloved marginal outsiders. So not just against kind of German Jews or against male homosexuals, all the groups that were clearly kind of targeted and singled out by the Nazi regime. The Nazis were very, very clear and open in 1933. There could be no Third Reich whatsoever without the destruction of the organized labor movement. So without the destruction of the organized German working class. Again, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and the trade unions. The German labor movement was the mightiest in the world outside of Russia. And in the last free elections of the Weimar Republic, so November 1932, more Germans voted for the Socialists or the Communists than voted for the Nazi Party. So Hitler and the Nazis blamed this on workers being led astray by socialist agitators and by Jews. And so the strategy of the Nazis during the seizure of power, which happens during the spring and summer of 1933, it doesn't happen on 30th of January 1933, that's just the start, is to hunt down the leaders of the working class and to terrorize it into silence. And this, crucially, would leave the workers both indirectly terrorized, but also accessible to the Nazi propaganda message of national unity. So our project found that by the end of 1933, perhaps 200,000 Germans had been locked up in assorted camps or torture cellars or improvised prison wings and beaten up, and some of them were killed. And because these are representatives of the German labor movement, they're very far from being outsiders to society, peripheral figures. You know, this is that they were part of a movement that managed to put together 13 million votes in the 1932 Reichstag elections. Our project also uncovered the countless ways that the camps intruded into German society. So in the press, in the economy, in conversations in pubs and taxis, in playground games, in sights and smells and sounds, even in people's dreams. The Nazis were very accomplished at choreographing popular acclaim, but also depended on an institutional web of terror and discipline, with imprisonment in the camp as the most feared and central sanction in the web. So although the pre-war camps didn't have gas chambers, they were terrifying and lethal places to be imprisoned. Inmates worked for 10 hours a day under the oversight of SS guards, like these ones here, on the bikes, who could beat and even shoot them at will. And the excuse that was used if a prisoner was shot, that it was a thwarted escape attempt. And there's 22 thwarted escape attempts in Dachau in the first few weeks. Now, releases from the camps were still frequent in the 1930s, and most prisoners emerged after a few months. They were warned not to speak of their experiences, but many inevitably did. But in doing so, they spread the message of Nazi terror to their social circles, which are exactly those that the Nazi regime is seeking to terrorize indirectly through mistreating these leading figures. Now, Galately claims that concentration camps were a popular institution amongst the German public. I think the quote is, Germans were proud of having a concentration camp in their town. And that far from being terrorized by them, they were welcomed as somewhere to keep unloved outsiders kind of locked up and kind of like away from the community. So communists, Jews, criminals, and layabouts. But in fact, we found that no single group in society could feel immune from the concentration camps. So there's workers, bosses, lawyers, doctors, journalists, priests, women, soldiers, even Nazis find themselves locked up for various reasons during the 1930s. It's also worth noting, as Nicholas Waxman has pointed out, that Hitler was careful never to set foot inside a concentration camp or even to be photographed anywhere near one, which is surprising if they were so popular given the propaganda obsession of the new regime. And this was vicious open terror, which continues all the way through to 1945. And what happens is the raw violence of 1933 becomes professionalized and institutionalized in the hands of the SS. And a procession of laws, decrees, and regulations give an appearance of legality to the Nazi terror. It's also worth stressing the role of the regular prisons in Nazi terror and discipline. And these are overlooked when you compare kind of the figures in camps with the figures in camps in other regimes. So before the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, most Germans are locked up in prisons and not in camps. And so although hundreds of thousands of Germans are locked up in camps of various kinds in 1933, the numbers drop quite quickly by the end of 1934. But it's a little known fact, to the voluntarists at least, that around a quarter of the population of German prisons in the mid-1930s were political prisoners. And these are people who are often accused, ironically, of themselves being terrorists. Conditions in prisons worsened in Nazi Germany, as they do under all conservative and right-wing regimes. But the deterioration is particularly rapid in Germany. The Nazis had long depicted the Weimar Republic's prisons as being kind of a soft touch, where inmates enjoyed a more comfortable life than people outside. And so in 1933, prison staff are quickly dismissed and they're replaced with pliant and committed men, often again SA men who will be given a job to do as a reward for their service to the movement. And the worst of the prisons in Nazi Germany, so for example in the Emsland in Saxony, looked and felt very much like concentration camps. And by 1938, you've got 9,000 inmates who are held in the Emsland, subject to random violence and to excruciating manual labor. And to make things even worse for prisoners, both criminal and political, they're often transferred from prisons to concentration camps at the end of their sentences. So the Nazis claimed that sentencing was too light even during the 1930s, undermining its deterrent and punishment offence. So as a result, perhaps a third of all prisoners were released from prison only to find the Gestapo waiting for them in the car park to take them to a concentration camp for a further unspecified period of supplementary terror. So I've just looked at the pre-war period. I hope what I've established is that things aren't quite as kind of as giddily happy for members of German society who weren't kind of who were part of the German labour movement. So these are not kind of peripheral figures. And they tend to be a bit older as well, because social democrats and trade unionists tend to be older than the young people that were spoken to by Johnson and Royband. So why does the recent historiography overlook all of this evidence? Why does it overlook the concentration camps? Why does it downplay terror and posit Nazi Germany as a feel-good dictatorship? I think there's a few reasons, and I'm speculating a little bit here, and I think Arthur's going to pick up on some of these points in his gig, but these are some of the things that we could discuss maybe in the questions. So the first is this patchy source base. So as Waxman put it, it's very hard to determine how popular the regime is if you're not allowed to criticize it in public. This makes it very hard to find sources where people are criticizing the regime openly. It doesn't mean that they all loved it. It just means that, you know, they're inhibited in some ways from expressing their aversion. This is why people rely on oral history taking a long time after Nazi Germany, because you have a few diaries of people that were kind of like that wrote kind of like oppositional content, but they were pretty damn careful that they didn't come to light afterwards. There's also a tendency by historians who tend to be, sadly, middle class, to extrapolate the outlook of the nation from kind of like quite a narrow section of its intelligentsia. So the educated Protestant middle class who kept diaries, and Galately and Peter Fritscher are particularly culpable here, because middle class people write kind of like interesting things in their diaries, and this can then be kind of like presented as being an insight into the entirety of the intelligentsia's view on the regime. You've also got an unrealistic model of citizenship. So even in an open democracy such as we have, if you don't resist or protest something, it doesn't mean you necessarily consent to it or approve of it. And to try and say that in Nazi Germany, where people were very much under social pressure and were very much liable to be beaten up for kind of like protesting something, it seems a strange thing to infer from the quiescence of German streets some kind of like great kind of like support for Hitler and for the Nazi regime. And they did 15 million working class families and communities consent to the destruction of the trade union movement in 1933 because only a tiny number of them actively resisted? Obviously not. A tricky one is, to what extent have historians, you and me and students, have we been sucked in by Nazi propaganda? Has Goebbels kind of like won something over on us? Because, you know, what we see from the Nazi regime is a carefully curated and choreographed scene of jubilation and ascent to the Nazi dictatorship. But private photographs tend to give a slightly more nuanced view. And the famous Nazi propaganda film, Triumph of the Will, which is a staple of any kind of TV documentary about German attitudes, this features party activists, not ordinary punters. So again, you've got to be careful with the claims you make from the social constituency that you have present in the document you're looking at. A focus on the Holocaust. So since 1989, the Holocaust has become front and center of historians' work on the Nazi regime, and absolutely right too. So when new archives opened in 1989, a whole wealth of information becomes available about the genocide of the European Jews. What this has done is it's rather overshadowed the pre-war years, as they sort of seem somehow kind of like sort of prosaic in their body count and their torment compared to the horrors which is unleashed on Europe in the 1940s. So German communists being slapped and beaten up in 1933 is less, you know, it's less shocking than the unique kind of like murderous dynamic of the Holocaust. Linked to this is what Richard Evans calls the judicialization of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So the 1980s, again, which is quite a watershed, you've come up a few times in this talk, you have an explosion of court cases into kind of like various events in the Second World War and the Holocaust, which encourages journalists and writers to explore the era in terms of guilt, in terms of judicial categories. So that you have perpetrators become written about, victims become a kind of like a identified group, accomplices, witnesses, and this is why Johnson and Royband's title, "What We Knew," very much falls into this this category of a bystander that knew too much, so that somehow it became complicit in the criminality. Finally, you have, and I'm happy to discuss this in the questions, the unflagging obsession in America and Britain with the Second World War, with the Nazis, and with the Holocaust. So in both countries, the Second World War remains the good war in national memory, in contrast to the more recent morally murky warmongering in the Middle East, for example. So as the late historian Peter Novick put it, for the American book market in particular, the tale of Germany in the first half of the 20th century becomes that of the old world, from which the formation of the United States, the new world, was in a way kind of deliverance. And according to national mythologies, which continue to saturate Anglophone politics, the ingrained pluckiness of the Brit and the rugged individualism of the American would have made Nazism unthinkable in either country, whereas the Germans, supposedly by definition, lack this upstanding character and abase themselves shamelessly before Hitler's regime. But the way I see it, the Nazi seizure of power better stands instead as a warning for what can happen when a massive economic crisis is poorly handled by the ruling classes. And there is a lesson to be drawn from the consolidation of Nazi power. It's not about the German national character or the evil genius and charisma of Adolf Hitler, to reference an appalling documentary that's sometimes on the television. Instead, it's about the muddled moral norms and the moral indifference that regimes can easily produce through creeping intimidation and propaganda. Terror works, indirectly as well as directly. It doesn't need to be at Big Brother levels to do so. If an extreme party comes to power, especially with paramilitary backing, existing institutions can be quite easily corrupted and co-opted for new purposes. In a Europe where extreme parties with a taste for street politics and aggressive masculinity are becoming increasingly popular, we do indeed, to quote a well-known documentary series, need to consider the Nazis as a warning from history. And my concern is that this warning is being lost in the current trend to exoticize and toward Germany as the other, as a set of individuals who abase themselves before authority and surrender their intelligence to the raw emotion of racism and Nazi dictatorship. And I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how we can communicate this better to post-16 and to post-18 students alike. So I'll stop there to leave some space for some questions, but I'm going to have one quick plug for King's. We have a history teachers network, which we'd love to work with you on. And if you're interested, then my colleague, Professor Adam Sutcliffe, is running it, and he can give you some more information. Thanks very much for listening.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks very much for that. I thought that was absolutely fantastic. I actually heard a very similar thing from Chris a few years ago, and kind of still resonates with me, still kind of use it in my teaching. And it was very useful to have kind of a kind of rework of that and also an update. So thank you very much. And I'm sure I echo everyone's thoughts really on that. There has been one question that has come in so far.
Okay.
If I pose this question and then please do everybody add questions to the chat whilst we're doing that. So this might be quite a quick one to clear off. So the question was RE reduced on the curriculum because Nazism was to be the new religion? And I wonder if that is the case, how far that kind of, where that fits into this kind of terror piece, indoctrination piece, and how kind of integral that is.
Yeah, no, well, very much. I mean, so religion is seen as being kind of like a rival source of moral authority, as being kind of a rival kind of cosmology for the way people interpret the world. And Nazism, you know, in its aspirations, if not in its accomplishment, was a totalitarian state. So in a political philosophical sense, it wanted to saturate every kind of area of society, because this was the way that you kind of like you turn people into warriors. There are different kind of strains within the Nazi movement, different kind of like pitches of anti-clericalism. So Himmler and the SS, for example, are kind of like the ideological cavalry of anti-clericalism, and priests are locked up in camps, and there's an attempt to substitute this weird kind of a sort of woodsy SS kind of ideology for Christianity. This starts to fade a little bit, kind of like by 1937, it's getting clear that this is not really going to be, they're not going to essentially remove this rival source of authority in its entirety. And it just cedes some space for German bishops to kind of like to criticize some aspects of the regime's kind of wartime policies, but really kind of like religion. It's something that kind of like that is shunted to one side. It becomes sort of like a private matter, and something that's not kind of promoted whatsoever in German schools. So yeah, it's very much, you know, there's an influential way of looking at Nazism as being a political religion in itself, that aspired to offer the same kind of clarity and totality as a Christian theology. There's something to that, even though in practice it wasn't actually kind of achieved on that level. And even Hitler kind of smirked a bit about kind of the SS and its attempt to create sort of a pagan, woodsy outlook.
So was that wasn't that kind of religious movement didn't have a big impact, or
not really? No, there was a group called the German Christians in 1933 who considered, at the end of the Weimar Republic, they called themselves the Stormtroopers of Jesus Christ, and they tried to kind of like to set aside Protestantism and to have it like a kind of a properly kind of like racist Christian theology. But it really kind of it fizzles out kind of in 1934, and it's generally seen as being a bit embarrassing. And interestingly, Hitler later in the war declares that, you know, that Christianity is far too flabby a religion anyway, and that he'd rather have had a more sort of like a bellicose kind of religion that Germans could have been like trained to become better warriors through. Yeah, it's they kind of they never quite achieve what they set out or claim to be achieving.
Is there any indication of why that is? I mean, I know I've heard it kind of mooted before that it's this potentially the strength of Catholicism in Germany, or equally Protestantism, I suppose, in some places. Is there credence in that? Is that kind of the generally accepted reason, or are there others?
Well, I mean, this is certainly what the churches claimed after 1945. So both the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church claim that kind of they throughout they've been kind of like shielding their flock from the evil kind of ideology of Nazism, and that they kind of like they criticized the regime and they risked their lives in doing so. And the idea that Catholics were kind of like were particularly kind of like resistant to Nazism has been very tenacious. As a scholar called Thomas Brodie at Cambridge, and he's kind of looked at Catholicism in the Second World War. He said that actually this is quite a myth, and there's no kind of like particularly kind of heroic character to German Catholics. Even you know there was very little said, for example, about the Holocaust by either church. And there's a lot of posturing after the war. And in some ways, this goes into the early historiography, because for Adenauer and West Germany, the idea is that you could rehabilitate Germans by focusing very much on Christianity. And therefore, the church was kind of cordoned off from any kind of like moral responsibility for what had happened. I mean, I wouldn't say churches are particularly active in kind of like in promoting Nazism, but during the Weimar Republic, they hadn't promoted democratic values. They kind of like they're suffused with kind of like classical anti-Semitism, so it's not a heroic and plucky picture at all. It's much more functional than that.
Thank you, that's really useful. There's been another question, another couple actually. The first one on kind of prison numbers versus concentration camp numbers. I agree with this actually. Katie said that was really interesting, and it's something that I'd never thought about before. I think it's an excellent point. But she just asks, were the numbers from the concentration camps, and I assume probably the prisons as well, were they just presumably from within Germany, those statistics that you shared?
So yes, this is all kind of in the pre-war period. It becomes more complicated from from 1939, when you have kind of like camps and things set up kind of elsewhere. These are all very much within Germany. So kind of it's all kind of a war. When it comes to like the wartime, there's kind of it's not quite the same kind of like pitch of disagreement, but I think it's the pre-war period that we need to focus on as being where terror against Germans is the most kind of like the most salient thing to ponder. It becomes more complicated morally, kind of like with the Holocaust and the Second World War. But the fact that Galatians can't deal with the earlier period, in my view, kind of casts into some doubt the way this is extrapolated into the later period.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, and I think useful for history teachers, in that thinking about Edexcel, for example, or other examples, lots of them do finish in 1939 for GC. They, I guess enables us to have that focus. Just been another couple of questions whilst we've been talking. So Mussolini was able to form a concordat with the church, a partnership and an agreement. Could Hitler have made more room for religion and cooperation with the church to his benefit and use the church as another vehicle of social influence.
Yeah, well, of course, Hitler signed a concordat as well with the Vatican and reneged on it very quickly. So the Catholic Church strikes one up with the Nazi regime, but immediately kind of the Nazi regime starts kind of like going back on all the provisions. But there's not really much that the Catholic Church can do, except perhaps call a crusade against Nazi Germany to enforce it. So the Catholic Church surrenders some of its kind of like moral capital in creating the agreement. The German Centre Party is wound up, and it does no good whatsoever really for the institutions of the Catholic Church. I don't think Hitler was really interested in working closely with churches. It's very much sort of like a totalitarian conception of kind of like the Nazism was in some ways, you know, kind of the answer to everything. You know, the First World War was the great kind of like guiding event of modern history. And you know, the Christian kind of like, you know, fairy tales as you'd see it from 2,000 years ago didn't really have very much to offer. There is some scholarship that kind of like that says that actually Hitler's ideology, Nazi ideology, was in many ways it just kind of borrowed elements from Christian theology. So it's the same kind of tale of prelapsarian innocence, fall, and then salvation, which is just kind of adapted to a modern context in which Hitler tries to sort of articulate his own life through. So there's something about borrowing some of the sort of the narrative structures of Christianity, but institutionally there was no great warmth. And there's probably an idea there would have been some kind of reckoning with the churches after 1945, but the war had to be won first, and there's no point in ruffling too many feathers, you know, until that point actually was achieved.
Thank you, that's really useful. Final question, I think. So this Andre, I think, says you mentioned that the role of camps being used by the Nazis. Could you comment on the degree to which the camps were common knowledge and how this changed across the Nazi regime?
Well, they're very, very common knowledge in 1933. So, I mean, you have hundreds and hundreds of camps set up in 1933, and very often they're set up in kind of like residential areas. So there's you know, in Berlin, there's hundreds of camps which are set up in working class districts. It's a very public type of terror. And then once the Nazi regime is kind of like it's securing the saddle from the summer of 1934, they start to be kind of rationalized into sort of like a small number, kind of half a dozen very large camps set in kind of like more remote settings where you know, the SS can get on with terrorizing without, you know, worrying about the environment. But they're still reported very much in the camp, in the news, in the media. So, you know, Himmler has a press conference in March 1933 to announce the opening of Dachau. And throughout the 1930s, there's tales, there's stories, reportage on the camps. But interestingly, it starts to report much more, and this is where the historian Paul Moore of Leicester has done some interesting research. The media starts to report less on the prisoners and more on the guards as being kind of like heroic figures, as being kind of like the ideological soldiers for Adolf Hitler. So there's a kind of a rebranding of the camps as being mainly about kind of like mainly about the guards, and then becoming great heroic soldiers for the future of Germany. And then towards the end of the Nazi regime in 1945, you have, again, hundreds of camps spreading out into all of German society. And these are usually kind of like work sites which are attached to particular camps. There's a kind of a symmetry between the first year, lots of camps in public, everyone can see them, everyone delivers bread to them, people interact with them. And again in 1945 when they're very visible as well. In the middle period, they're more experienced through the media, but they're always there. I mean, people knew about the camps. If you wanted to know, you could know a great deal of information about them.
I wonder if there's a difference there between, and this is a question, is there a difference between the kind of concentration camps and the death camps as we think of them? I mean, I'm thinking of kind of Band of Brothers, and when the dramatization of that when they find the camp in that episode is the local people in the town nearby don't know anything about it, certainly claim they know nothing about it. Would that have been the case with death camps? In the same way as you say concentration camps become more visible again by 1945, is there a difference there, or they're more similar?
Well, I mean, the death camps were all in Poland, so they weren't on German soil, so they wouldn't have had the same kind of immediate kind of contact with German citizens as kind of like somewhere like Dachau or Buchenwald. I mean, soldiers certainly knew a great deal about the death camps. Kind of like when trains used to go past Auschwitz, people would have rushed to the windows to have a look at the camp. So it was very well known, but people didn't like to dwell on what they knew kind of after the war. And it was possible to have a kind of an inculcated ignorance to think that there's something terrible that's happening, you know, kind of like in Poland, in the general government, but I don't know much more. But we can see that soldiers' photographs, soldiers' letters, there's plenty of evidence that if you wanted to know, again, you know, there's plenty to find out. People would go and like witness executions of Jews in 1941. So, you know, the information passes very quickly through a big army, and then it passes from a big army back to home. So the idea of complete ignorance is highly implausible in almost every case.